and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. So tonight, we're very excited to have Jim Cates with us to talk about the history of voter suppression against people of color in the United States. Jim was born in 1945 in White Plains, New York, but volunteered as a freshman at Wesleyan for the Mississippi Summer Project. He worked in 1964. He was part of the what they call Freedom Summer, which was an intentional confrontation with the tactics and system of voter suppression. He has been a contributor to the anthologies What Does It Mean to Be White in America? Black Lives Have Always Mattered. He's a member of the Veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. He's gonna talk to us a little bit today about how voter suppression works, where it's being employed, and how we can fight it. So, Jim, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Well, we appreciate everybody having your being here. You are welcome to have your camera on or off. This is being live streamed, so if you're uncomfortable having your name or likeness on the internet, feel free to use a pseudonym or turn off your camera. And we do ask that if that until the Q&A you stay muted. And we'll have during the time for Q&A, you're welcome to raise your virtual hand or physical hand, or put an asterisk in the chat, and I'll recognize you to ask your own question. Or if you're a little bit shy about having your voice shared, you can just type it in the chat and I'll read it off. So, Jim, take it away. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. It's funny, if we were doing this even 3 or 4 years ago, I think I would have felt more comfortable imparting information. But voter suppression has become such a live issue recently, I rather hesitate. I think that maybe most people at the other side of the screen here already know a great deal already about it and the way it works and the way it needs to be contested. I think what I can bring maybe is a little bit of a historical perspective and getting into the mechanics of the way things have been done, because I think it's going to be clear that whatever is being done now is exactly modeled on, either consciously or unconsciously, what has been practiced in this country for 150 years. And there's nothing new about it, which is, by the way, one of the more painful things about trying to fight it now. We've done all this. We shouldn't have to be doing it again. But it keeps needing to be done. I want to begin with Shelby, the Supreme Court Shelby County decision. Shelby County v. Holder decision in 2013. And I would expect that most people were familiar with that decision, which overturned key elements of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had a provision in it that said that specific areas of the country of the South could be singled out and monitored for election irregularities and voting irregularities and voter suppression. And the Supreme Court overturned that in 2013 in the Shelby County case. And many people in the movement were very upset and thought it was wrongly decided. But the real problem with the Shelby case is not that it was wrongly decided, but that it was rightly decided. Legally, it was rightly decided. By 2013, in a way, there was no reason to distinguish certain specific counties and areas of the Deep South from the rest of the country. And the remedy for voter suppression and the irregularities rests not with a law from 1965 that was specifically aimed, but as the court rightly said, the remedy lay with the US Congress to make the provisions nationwide. So what we have here was the decision was right because the country was going wrong. which is an odd conclusion from that particular decision. And what was so I want to go back. What I want to do is go back to what gave rise to the conditions of the 1965 Voting Act that led to the Shelby overturning and led to where we are today throughout the country. It was my lucky privilege to be part of one of the key elements in leading up to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was the situation in the state of Mississippi in 1962, 63, and 64. So the history a little bit back here. We go back actually most immediately to 1890. In 1890, Mississippi adopted a new constitution which did not accord with the agreements and legalities after Reconstruction. It was a constitution that completely finally wiped out the last remnants of Reconstruction in the state, and that instituted a number of voting restrictions that were deliberately put in place to keep freedmen and their descendants from voting. One of these was the poll tax, and we won't go into the poll tax too much at this point, but it needs to be acknowledged. The poll tax was put into effect that said that in order to be able to register to vote, you had to pay a tax to the local authority. Now, this, of course, was a financial burden on many people. Sometimes it was an impossible burden. It was also instituted that you had to have paid your poll tax 2 years in advance, 2 years before, which put a nice little other hitch on it, which made it virtually impossible, especially in the case of those people who had moved from one place to another. So what you had was you had first the poll tax, and then you had other restrictions put on that barred people from voting, to the extent that by the First World War, most people of color in Mississippi were no longer able to register to vote. When I came to work in Panola County in 1964, there were, I think, if I remember correctly, 6 registered Black voters in the entire county. And I think at least 2 or 3 of them, one of them Reverend Middleton, who was a very old man at the time, had registered before World War I. So what you had was a system that put into place a way of keeping people, a specific legal way of keeping people from voting, and a lot of that went through the application and the registration procedure. First of all, the procedure was controlled by a local registrar in the county. The registrar had virtual complete authority on times that the polling places would be open, and also on passing on the application for registration to vote. Second of all, there was a moral turpitude clause, which said that anyone could raise a question about the moral status of an applicant to register to vote. And the way in which this was determined in most counties in Mississippi and throughout the South was that if you applied to register to vote, your name was published in the local newspaper for 2 weeks. This is for applying to register to vote. This is not registering to vote. This is for applying to register to vote for 2 weeks before your application could be accepted. This, of course, made every application to register public in the worst way. I have to say that in 1964, this got turned around, because once people started to get the courage to register to vote, it became not only a way for the freedom workers in Mississippi to check on who had actually gone to apply to register to vote, but it also became an honor roll and a listing for the people who did go down and apply to register to vote. But its purpose was intimidation. And what you had come along was the application itself and what you had to do in order to apply to register to vote. And I'd like to lead you through that now with some of the things I think everyone got that, but I'm going to screen share it now to take a look at it. And I'd kind of like maybe to come off mute so we can talk about that a little bit at some point. The sworn written application, I have the version which was in use in 1964, which provision of Constitution of Mississippi was adopted in 1955. The date 1955 is not accidental. It's a moment at which time the civil rights movement is beginning to heat up in the Deep South. And I think I do not know what the exact wording was before 1955, but I'm willing to pretty much guarantee that this made things more stringent. Okay, so the first thing you're facing is a literacy problem. If you want to keep someone from registering to vote, you'll notice it says required to fill in this form in his own handwriting in the presence of the registrar and without assistance or suggestion of any other person or memorandum. So first of all, you have the ability to read or write on your own, which is a necessary qualification to vote in Mississippi. Again, this is at the complete discretion of the registrar. We had documented cases in Mississippi where, while some of our applicants actually were in the office, a telephone call would come in and the registrar would answer the phone and say, "Oh yes, he turned 21, congratulate him for me, I'll put his name on the books." And then presumably the application as a matter of form would be taken care of later at some other point. Obviously, the person on the other end of the line was white and well respected and known in the community by all those means. Okay, so we have, first of all, the literacy consideration. Then you get questions that start looking innocuous, but are really trickier than they look like. What is your full name? As of now, to this day, if I wanted to register to vote in the state of Georgia, I could not. I would be ineligible. Because my full name as it appears on my passport is not the same as my full name as it appears on my birth certificate. One says George James, the other says James George. And that in Georgia right now is reason to invalidate an application. So in other words, you go in, you have to state your name. You have to state your name in a way that is known or accepted by the clerk. And your name may appear in different ways and other forms, and you can be disqualified even as you try to write your name. State your age and date of birth. Occupation, again, becomes a pitfall. Where you are working makes a difference. When Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who became such an activist in Mississippi, went down to apply to register to vote for the first time, she had been a bookkeeper for nearly 20 years or more on a plantation. She got back to the plantation. By the time she got back to the plantation, after applying to register to vote, the plantation owner met her and asked her to remove her application and take her name off as soon as she got back. She said memorably, "Mr. Marlowe, I didn't go down there to register for you. I went down to register for myself." And by the next day, she was homeless and jobless. So this becomes a pitfall, this simple question: where is your business carried on? By whom are you employed? Are you a citizen of the United States? How long have you resided in Mississippi? Where is your place of residence in the district? How many of you can answer that question? When I usually do this, we do this as a kind of role-playing workshop, and we can go a lot of back and forth here. Where your place of residence in the district is not necessarily just your home address. In many Mississippi communities, parts of the town have different names. The wards have different numbers. To know that and to write it correctly is a pitfall. Specify the date when such residence began, and then set your prior place of residence, if any, your history is following you around, and more than that, how long you have been a resident is a question. This is one place, by the way, right now, I think, where New Hampshire is behind Mississippi right now under current law. I think New Hampshire demands a longer residency than Mississippi does, and because of the number of college students in New Hampshire, this issue of where is your official place of residence and how long have you lived there is one of the questions that carries with it a lot of weight in an application to register to vote. Question 12 may be one of the simplest and least complicated. It simply reflects that if you were a minister in the Deep South, you tended to be more transient, and therefore you were allowed theoretically more liberty and less time of residency, and your wife was allowed that. So you could say, that's okay. Have you ever been convicted of any of the following crimes? This, again, is one of the major issues that's still with us today. The use of crime, particularly felony conviction, to disallow someone from registering to vote. This ties in with other issues. I don't know whether you've had people talk before about that, about the penal system and the way the penal system is used racially, and the statistics specifically that keep Black men from voting. And the crimes, I think the crime list now, someone told me recently it was 38 crimes, but official crimes that could keep you from voting. I counted up only 18, but I suppose that depends on how you slice the ticket. In 1964, this was not a definitive list then, but it was a list that would throw off or confuse people trying to fill out a form who weren't particularly literate. One of the things we would work with people when we were talking about going over the form to prepare them to apply was to say, if you don't recognize the names, the words of any of these crimes, you probably have not been convicted of them. Okay. Okay, then, so 16 and 17, again, we like to relate to religion and ministry. And then you get to question 18 and 19. Write and copy in the space below section blank of the Constitution of Mississippi. And the registrar picks the section. Mrs. Hamer, her first time was given this, and you might try quickly. You might copy this out. And then write in a space below a reasonable interpretation of it. Ex post facto laws or laws impairing the obligation of contracts shall not be passed. May I have your 1-minute essay on what that means? These questions, these essay questions, this and the right in the space below, in the space below a statement setting forth your understanding of the duties and obligations of citizenship, were key in a major case in Mississippi that tested the Mississippi application for registration before the Civil Rights Act was passed. There were several counties, including the county I was working in, where there was a federal injunction based on past court cases that eliminated these three questions. eliminated the essay questions. Just simply that. They limited the essay questions, and they also specified specifically where and how the courthouse had to be open so that you could register to vote or apply to register to vote. Then you'd think you're through, right? You go down to 21 to the oath. But actually, when I typed this up, I actually made a slight typographical error. It's correct in this one, in this section. Once again, you have to know at this point what they call your election district. Now, that may be a number, or in many cases, especially in small towns, it's a name. And if you give the number and you're supposed to give the name, then you've got it wrong. James Silver, in his book, Mississippi, the Closed Society, has documented cases where the registrar corrects for a white applicant miswriting in that blank and refuses to pass a black applicant because she does not give the exact wording. Okay, so this is what the form looks like. And as we go through the form, we can recognize pretty much everything that we see going on today. We can talk about intimidation on the outside, which occurs in more subtle forms. We can talk about financial obligations that are put on people in the form of not direct poll tax. By the way, in 1964, when Congress ratified the 24th Amendment, although it eliminated the poll tax in federal elections, it did not say anything about the poll tax in state elections. So that stayed in place through until after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So what happens here? So we have intimidation. You have access. What kind of access can you get to the polling, not just the polling place, first of all, but also to be able to register to vote? When can it be open? You have a question of the subjectivity and the authority of the people who are judging and administering this. And this is something that's coming up very, very much now, obviously, in states around the country as these new repressive laws are trying to put in. Who gets control over looking over the application procedure? And then later on, who gets to look over the ballots? It's the same question. Who has control? Who controls the counting? Who controls all along the way? Who also has access to be able to help is a question. This is being restricted in many parts of the country. It was restricted in Texas this year, most notably in the last election. Who cares? Who has access to being able to help a voter get through whatever the procedure is? I think that covers sort of the main points. And we can go back and talk more about the specific things that went on and how we worked. When we worked in Mississippi in 1964, we had to do citizenship education where we went over the forms with people. We accompanied them to the courthouse. And one of the hardest things we had to do was to talk with people about why they didn't want to register to vote. And this goes beyond intimidation. And this is something we need to think about. It's easy to think about the intimidation aspect of it. But when I was working voter registration in Mississippi just 3 years ago, we were finding a lot of resistance in local rural Black communities for people wanting to register to vote. And we found that it had to do also with peripheral concerns. when you register to vote, you're put on jury rolls. And a lot of people did not want to register to vote because they live in small towns, in counties, and they did not want to be put in a position where they would have to be put on a jury judging their peers. And this is something you couldn't have found, you couldn't have figured out beforehand. You couldn't have worked out this kind of concern that you have to get over. So the other thing you have to do is the natural reluctance of people. We think of voting as a privilege. We think of it as a right. We think of it as something we're eager to rush down and do. We have to recognize that when we're talking about voter suppression and the other side of that, voter registration, it's not just fake information and being handed out around the way, but people have genuine concerns to take up that we need to address when we're working with them. Getting out and getting to know people one-on-one, being there for people is critical. And this becomes harder and harder in our polarized society. And I guess maybe I'd like to open this up. I'm talking too much. Let me stop there and go. Let's go where you want me to go, not where I think I should go.
All right, folks. So again, feel free to put an asterisk in the chat or use the virtual hand raise function. Chances are I won't be able to see you if you're just raising your hand on the screen. So the asterisk or the hand raise is preferred if you've got a question. Generally find that once a question comes out, it starts going pretty smoothly. I was going to ask, I mean, how are things in New Hampshire on voter suppression? I imagine that what you're talking about, that sense that that people maybe don't want to vote, or nervous about voting, or that they feel like it's not consequential, is a major hurdle. But how bad is voter suppression in New Hampshire right now in your mind?
I'm not the best person to speak to that because I'm still working in Mississippi, actually more than in New Hampshire. But there are certain conditions. There's certain ironic conditions that, as I say, are better in the Deep South now, partly because they've been remedied in the past, than they are in New Hampshire. The residency one of case of college students. I'm not sure what is the condition of previous felonies in New Hampshire for voting. I know we have a fairly easy ballot system, a fairly comfortable ballot system. I don't know of any town, I haven't heard of any town in New Hampshire that has had trouble with the officials being taken over. Our system is pretty straightforward there and fairly simple. It is remarkable now that where 5 or 6 years ago, I could walk into my polling place, and by the time I got in the door, the clerk sitting there would say, "Hi, Jim," and hand me a ballot. That same person will now ask me to show identification, which becomes, in our small town communities, a little ludicrous.
Sorry, Jim. So Arnie clarifies, former felons can vote after completing sentence in New Hampshire.
Okay, that's.
Did you have more you wanted to say there? There is a question from Lindsay that I'll jump into.
No, let's take what comes.
Okay. So Lindsay asks, how do you address collateral concerns about, for example, being put on a jury selection list? And what other concerns are people concerned about as far as getting voter registration and lists they might wind up on?
The only way you can really address that is in a neighborly way, in a one-to-one way. One of the problems now with canvassing for voter registration is that it is done rather mechanically. I know I'm going to, and I was rather surprised. I was a little bit thrown off when I was working in Mississippi 3 years ago. And you have your cell phone, and you have your minivan call in, and you check off people and you go to doors and you rack up numbers of households you go to, and you've already know a lot of the history of the people at the households. I'm not sure that's always helpful, because the questions you're asking are questions that can only be resolved by a much slower, more intimate process. And then, in fact, that's the way we learned about the jury duty thing, is by actually stopping and talking with people. Otherwise, because they're not going to tell us that. And people have concerns. People have concerns about transportation. That's a very big concern. And it's not enough sometimes to be able to say, oh, well, we'll have an Uber pick you up, or whatever the local equivalent is. People are concerned about not knowing the forms and the bureaucracy. But beyond that, it really is, it's a question of individuality. It's a question of people have their own ways and their own rhythms of going about things. Does that answer the question at all?
I think so. So Chris Hansen asks, with an application this difficult, how successful were you in getting people registered? And what was your success rate once you actually got people in?
Okay, if we're talking about the summer of 1964, we had the special court order in Panola County that eliminated the 3 essay questions and set specific times and places where the courthouse had to be open. By December 1964, we had about 1,000 of the Black community people registered to vote. In other words, who had passed and registered to vote. We were untypical because we had the special court order there and a little bit of federal attention there. What we did at the same time, though, in Mississippi that summer was run a freedom vote, was run a parallel Democratic Party, integrated party, dummy shadow party that had a very simple application procedure. And we later took that to the Atlantic City Convention, and in a whole other part of the history of this, were very successful. But with the freedom vote, what we did was register people who wanted to register to vote but couldn't get to the process itself. And I think by the end of the summer, we were hoping for well over 100,000, but we had something like 60 or 70,000 freedom registrations.
So observation from Doreen, there's currently a group called Voter Integrity Project that is knocking doors on the Seacoast, questioning people about their absentee voting eligibility. They seem to be well funded. Doreen, can you say anything more? Is that, do we think that's a group trying to call absentee ballots into question after the 2016 election?
After this past one, the 2020, the 2020. And they're also 2020. They're also asking about whether about students that live there that may have voted absentee. League of Women Voters considers it voter intimidation.
Yes, this is the kind of subtle thing that you don't need to come outright and say you are losing your job tomorrow or whatever. You can simply, by raising the question, to go back to the question before about what makes people uneasy. The fact of helping make people uneasy is itself a form of suppression.
Yeah, if you knock on the door of my 87-year-old mother-in-law who voted absentee, she's never going to vote again.
Yeah.
And that's going to happen with a lot of people.
So Will Thomas asks, I'm curious if the notorious white councils still exist in Mississippi, and how many Black Americans have been elected to leadership positions such as mayor in Mississippi?
Well, Mississippi is proud to say that it has the largest proportion of Black elected officials of any state in the country. I can attest that some of those are honorable people and some of them are as corrupt as the white politicians. Mississippi has achieved parity and has achieved, and in that on local levels and statewide levels. And in the Deep South, that has been throughout, partly because for a generation or two, the Black populations of Mississippi, the populations of color of the Deep South, recognized what we take for granted, how important, how valuable, how necessary the vote is. And we're not talking, and this is important, this comes back to a little bit what I was saying before when I talked about the poll tax. It's not a question of federal elections. The elections that matter are very often the elections that people pay no attention to. One of the things that we became very concerned with all of a sudden was the Agricultural Conservation Stabilization Service, which was set up in the New Deal, but which had elected county officials that determined who would get what allotments agriculturally in the county. Now, if you don't have any say in that board, it doesn't matter who's president. I think we're really facing a crisis right now with school board elections, even more than municipal elections. And I think it's on that level, and our tendency to ignore electoral issues between the major elections is one of the serious problems that we have to deal with. And it's quite frankly something that the far right is paying a lot of attention to, the local level. So yeah, the Deep South, the effects of the Civil Rights Bill, of the 1965 Civil Rights Bill in the Deep South, was to create societies which in many ways are more equitable than a lot of societies in the North. Partly because what has worked more in the North has been gerrymandering. And while gerrymandering can be very effective in parts of the South, in other parts of the South, because the population is not so segregated, it's not that easy to gerrymander.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought about that. So Arnie
in urban
and
areas,
Judy,
obviously you can, but certainly not in rural areas.
yeah. So either Arnie or Judy asks, if there's time, please tell us about your interactions with Bob Moses and Stokely Carmichael, and about interactions now between Freedom Summer veterans and young activists.
Let me start at the other end. It was amazing. It was really, really interesting 3 years ago, and I would have been back since then, but other events get in the way, to go back to Mississippi and work voter registration again. There were 4 of us who were veterans, who were Freedom Summer veterans, who went back, started working with this new group called Mississippi Votes. And it was a very warm, very welcoming, it was like the old days. We couldn't pay for our own lunches at Tougaloo College. But one of the frightening things about it, in a way, was that we would be at gatherings and people would invoke the ancestors. And we sort of realized we were the ancestors. We were the ancestors they were invoking. The other comic aspect of this was, as we were driving north on Route 49, famous route through Mississippi, 4 aging white guys with weak bladders, trying to make the revolution all over again. We were sort of thinking this belongs in a John Sayles story or something. This is a comedy to be made. It would have been more of a comedy had we remembered our lessons less. We did not come in as authorities. We came in to learn from the kids. And when they sought us, what we found out was, because things have changed so much, we had a lot more to learn from them than they had to learn from us. And we had a certain symbolic value, which I think was valuable. And when we went back into the counties where we worked, was valuable. But I think the real actual functional value, all of the learning came our way. As for Bob Moses, He's one of the great heroes of my life. I mourn his passing, but it wasn't unexpected. He is a major influence. Stokely Carmichael, also you mentioned, was also a major influence in my life. Oddly enough, I think Arnie and Judy know this, Stokely was the one who led me from tactical nonviolence to philosophical nonviolence, which is, of course, not the direction he himself went into. But it was part of the movement in those days. And I think we need to remember this also nowadays, is that it was intellectually alive, not frozen in ideology, and that people talked back and forth and traded ideas and listened to one another, even within our own groups. And I think that's something, again, that I miss rather sadly from the current movement. I don't know if that answers your questions, Judy and Ernie.
It addresses it a bit. It also, I mean, it has parallels to some of the things that have been going on in New Hampshire activism lately, where young people are teaching old folks who've done the work, and I'm counting myself among the old folks here because it seems to be where I've fallen most frequently, but teaching us things about how to be activists in this era. So I appreciate the commentary because it resonates with what a lot of us have experienced here in New Hampshire.
I think, yeah, when I look for leadership now, I look to, the kids in Florida, the people who are teaching us new ways to use the new means, which I say I do find their limitations, as I say, but they also have the advantages, like being on screen.
So here's a tough one from Kurt Smith. Kurt asks, how does the right to vote relate to working to curtail the military-industrial complex and promoting nonviolence? So tying it into our umbrella mission.
Yeah, well, those are two separate things. I mean, voting is nonviolence. Voting is nonviolent action, and I think it's important that we recognize that, and we know, and that's our sort of our starting point. It's an essential part of nonviolent action. The military-industrial complex, of course, you can sort of look at in the broad sense, and that is our effect on policy. But it also affects something else, and it affects our sense of power and our sense of what we can accomplish. And it may affect the way people think of what they're doing when they go into the military. Young people, when they go into the military, they want to do good. They want to do something for the country. Some people may not see that there are other ways. Just on that elemental, again, individual one-on-one level. And then, of course, beyond that, there's using that power of the vote so that we can change the larger issues. One of the hardest things, though, about working with registering to people to vote is trusting that people will want to vote your way without being able to make that case. It's one of the hardest things to do. One of the reasons I worked with Mississippi Votes rather than with the Mississippi Democratic Party, I talked with people at the Mississippi Democratic Party, is because Mississippi Votes is trying to encourage the empowerment of registration, not the ideological empowerment of our side. And there is a distinction that has to be maintained, because it's not true empowerment if I'm just trying to empower my people.
Thank you. It's a good reminder to us all.
It's a hard question, but it's a hard issue.
All right. So I don't see more questions right now. Oh, there we go. Diane's got one. No, it's a comment. Diane says, "Thank you. A great reminder to us all." And it was a question that had come up for me.
Yeah, I think it's something that that needs more thinking about too, for those from those of us, for our own examination. I mean, we don't need to be encouraged to vote. We know the power. We know we see a lot of, but what do we do when we show up and someone says, yes, yes, drive me down to the courthouse so I can vote for Donald Trump? And we have to come to terms with where we come
Right.
down with that.
Yeah. When you're advocating for the right to vote, it's not
It's the right
advocating
to
to the
vote.
right
It
to
is-
vote for your person. It's the right
It
to
is
vote.
its own power.
Yeah. So David Blair asks, did you feel the courts were more on your side in 1964 than they are today?
Oh, absolutely. Well, no. Depends on which courts we're talking about. I mean, at that time, the Fifth Circuit was probably more liberal than most of the South, but it was still quite segregationist. The federal courts were feeling their way. Were feeling their way through. There was, but there was what there was a different reading of the Constitution. I don't want to put it on being on our side or not, but a different reading of the Constitution in the federal courts, so that now it feels as though things are more ideological in the courts. Although, as I say, we have to watch that, because some of the decisions like Shelby that we think are ideological are not ideological and actually should be pointing us in the right direction. I want to come back to that our remedies are in the vote in Congress. If we can get back there, if we can get there.
So Marcia asks, how do you feel about federal laws impacting state laws relative to voting? The federal laws recently.
Well, here's where you get to the wonderful legal system. You know, those people who embraced the full faith and credit of the United States when it supported individual states supporting gay marriage would presumably also have supported the Dred Scott decision. We have to realize that legality is not the same as the kind of morality or the kind of just society we're looking for. And the laws are important, but the laws are a tool. They're serving they're serving where we want things to go. And that can be dangerous. Again, that's again one of those statements that can be very, very dangerous. But we depend on the laws to set the skeleton or the framework, but we don't expect them to do the work, the actual work.
So we're getting a little low on time. Something that I know I want to know is what do you think we in New Hampshire should be doing to ensure that voter suppression doesn't have as much power as it does here? What do you see as the strategies we could be using to help support ballot access, in particular for people of color, but in general?
We have to make ourselves available. I mean, again, that come right back down. It comes to taking on obviously, the ultimate answer to that is we've got to get people in this legislature who will make the laws which will open up and free up. We have to have easier access is one of the biggest issues nationwide now. Oddly enough, in this time of absolute communication, the closing down of access is one of the major tools, whether it's those voting boxes or absentee voting or same day voting, that needs to be expanded. In the absence of that, our ability to work with getting people to the ballots, getting people registered to the courthouses, getting people to know what the vote means, to know what it means to them individually. It's an on the ground, and it cannot sit around and wait until 6 weeks before election. And it certainly can't wait for the next presidential election. Now I get preachy. Now I get preachy.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we have two more questions in the chat. Chris Hansen, would the correct response to Shelby County decision have been that every change, I think what he's going for here is that every county should change throughout the country.
Yes,
or should every change be federally approved?
The correct response to Shelby would be to extend federal oversight to federal elections at least, and that eventually would the electoral process. But that kind of oversight, to make it nationwide rather than focused on certain counties which had been declared delinquent years before.
So Kurt Smith, how important is it to pass federal voting legislation? Should that be part of our strategy around this?
I think that's very important, but also county, state level in this case, because the states control their own voting procedures. And as long as we have that, we need to focus on our state systems. And it's a battle we may be losing right now. I'm actually quite frightened about this, and not in New Hampshire so much. New Hampshire will go conservative and right wing, but we'll do it in a cautious conservative way. And I'm not as worried about New Hampshire as I am about some of the other states. But yes, it doesn't mean we stop. I mean, New York has its problems. Massachusetts has its problems. Probably Vermont does.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are really surprised at how not conservative the legislature in New Hampshire has been this cycle.
Well, this is partly just the result because we have not paid attention to the last couple of local elections. This is exactly a consequence of. If I can just tell one more anecdote. I had a good friend who volunteered with the first Obama campaign. And he came in as a volunteer, and he rose until he was being in charge of handling the volunteer systems for all of Pennsylvania and Ohio during the election. And the minute that Obama was elected, of course, we were all pleased, we were all happy, and we were all cheering, and it was a wonderful event. Or for most of us, I think. Ben went and took a job in Washington. And at that point, and I don't like to say, I said, uh-oh, it's over. This was an election, not a movement. The people like Ben needed to stay in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and we know what happened in 2010. And I think that's as much the responsibility of the people who left the movement in 2008 as it is of those who went door to door in 2010.
It's a poignant commentary on how we as activists need to keep going and need to recognize that elections are they're punctuation, but they're never an end. That we need to keep pushing. And unfortunately, we are just about out of time. Jim, I want to thank you so much for being here with us.
As usual, today. I think I've blathered.
You were great. It was just what we wanted, and I know I deeply appreciate hearing it and hearing it from somebody who was has been part of this struggle for years. So everyone can feel free to stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action by checking us out at nhpeaceaction.org. We do this conversation conversation series every other Monday night, 7 to 8. So stay with us. Make sure you are on our email list. The series will remain free and open to everyone. And if you're inspired to give, you can go to nhpeaceaction.org/donate. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm seeing lots of positive comments in the chat.
Can I say hi, Arnie? Because I just saw Arnie's face for the first time.
Go for it. Yeah. Lots of gratitude, and the chat is full of folks saying thank you, and it was very informative. And I
thank you very much.
Appreciate you being here.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you. Okay.
So our,
And put
our
me on the
next-
list, put me on the list for other ones of these too, by the way.
yeah, we'll do. So our next few conversation series on November 15th, we'll host Becky Field. She's going to talk about the spirituality of peacemaking. November 16th, we'll be showing The War Game, which is a film from I believe it's the early 60s. And Ira Helfand will be talking about the danger of nuclear war. November 22nd, we'll be hosting Anthony Harris, who's going to talk about the movement for decarceration. So stay in touch, make sure you get on our email list, send an email to info@nhpeaceaction.org if you don't think you're on our email list, and we'll see everyone in a couple weeks.
Thank you,
Thanks
Will.
again, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you,
Good night,
everybody.
everyone.
Hi, Lena.